good evening. I'm just here to say very brief couple of words. Welcome to the Sami Opera Centre and welcome to London Business School for those that are not part of our community. My name is Tiago Martino. I'm the Executive Director of the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development here at London Business School. And on behalf of the Institute, LBS, thank you very much for coming. A very warm welcome to Arunma, Oteh, and your interest. Thank you for your time. We look forward to hearing and learning from you tonight. The motto of London Business School is to have a profound impact in the way that the world does business and how business impacts the world. At the Wheeler Institute, we are very much committed with improving lives through business. So we look at the big development challenges that the world is facing, we come with business insights to help to solve those challenges, and we engage in communities of learning and practice to foster scale and hopefully enduring change. We very much focus on developing countries, so tonight is a great opportunity to bring our communities together. So I can recognize many of our students in the audience, some of the ones, so thank you very much for joining us. And to discuss a topic that perhaps has been away from the highlights or flashlights of the news recently, but we deeply believe that is important to discuss, so we're very committed and engaged with it. Thank you especially to the Royal African Society and Standard Chartered who are working so well together and putting creating this event. Thank you to my team that's been in the office, have been working hard as well to put it together. And again, special thanks to Arunma and you for coming in. I hope you enjoy the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Nick Westcott. I'm the Director of the Royal African Society. You reminded me, Tiago, that I once went to a meeting where I asked, "Can you hear me at the back?" The man put up his hand and said, "I can hear you fine, but I'll happily change places with someone who can't." Which was not an encouraging start. However, the Royal African Society, as some of you may already know, has existed for 120 years, and its objective has been to promote Africa in the UK and increasingly in Africa and globally. Our mission is to amplify African voices and to increase understanding about the continent. And we're therefore absolutely delighted to go into partnership with the Wheeler Centre, the London Business School, and with Standard Chartered on this occasion, to have a very serious conversation about one of the most serious issues affecting not just Africa, but the world, where our role in the financial sector's role is going to be really central. That's only one of the things that we do. We have a business program, we have a number of platforms, we enable these kind of debates to take place. We do it in Parliament as well through our all-party parliamentary group for Africa. We have an academic journal, African Affairs. We have an online magazine, African Arguments, and I recommend all these to you, at which these kind of issues are debated and make sure they're in the public domain. We also do a great deal of work on cultural and creative sectors. And in particular, we run two festivals, one literary, Africa Lights. In alternate years, we have a film festival, Film Africa, which is taking place later this month. It begins on the 28th of October here in London, cinemas all across London. We have 48 fantastic films, 22 of them premieres from Africa. Go online, look up Film Africa, come along and join us, because there's some really fantastic, innovative filmmaking coming out of Africa, and it's actually one of the most rapidly growing sectors of African economies, is the creative sector, because there is such a wealth of talent there, and now it's being known across the world. In the middle of this, we've decided it was a good thing, as we've reached 120, what it really needs is a party. So we will be holding an anniversary, 120th anniversary gala in the middle of the Film Africa Festival on the 2nd of November, date for your diaries. Tickets are available on our website, don't miss it. And if you want to ensure you don't miss any of these events, the whole range of programs that we're involved with already in our activities, please join the society. It's very economic and you get fantastic value, so please do that. But I now want to hand over to Arunma Oteh, who's chairperson of the Royal African Society for getting on for a year now. And we're delighted to have her. She's well known in international financial circles. She was Vice President of the African Development Bank, Treasurer of the World Bank, and Director General of the Nigerian Securities and Exchange Committee, which, as any of you who know Nigeria will understand, this is not a job for the faint-hearted. And our chair is certainly not faint-hearted, she conducted it with brilliance. So, Arunma, we're delighted to have you, and I can't think of anyone more appropriate to moderate this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tiago, and thank you very much, Nick, for first to Nick for your kind introduction, and also just for what you've shared about our 120-year-old organization. You know, earlier we were speaking with Bill, and Standard Chartered I think is 165 years old. I used to always feel like the oldest in the room, but Standard Chartered has been around longer than us. I want to thank Tiago and his colleagues at the Wheeler Institute, the Africa Club, for this opportunity to use this absolutely amazing place for this event. I also just want to start by welcoming each and every one of you that is here today. I'm absolutely delighted that our lecture this year is on how to fund sustainable growth in Africa. This is because of how important sustainable growth is for Africa, but also because of the urgent need to address what I consider a huge funding gap. The United Nations Economic Commission in Africa estimates that to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, that Africa needs at least $1.3 trillion per year from now till 2030. And of course, it would rise even further given population and other issues. Last month, FSD Africa, Climate Policy Initiative and the Children's Investment Fund published a report on climate finance landscape in Africa. And they estimate that for the 10 years leading up to 2030, that we will need $2.8 trillion, just based on what was submitted in terms of the nationally determined contributions of all African countries. So this is about $280 billion per year. Who can guess how much is available today? Okay.
10% of that.
That's a really smart TPG. It's $35 billion, so you're right on the money. And most of this is coming from the public sector. So for Africa, I think 19% of the climate finance funding basically comes from the private sector, and the rest comes from the public sector, mainly development agencies. For other regions, that report says about 40%. So I think the continent needs all of the innovative instruments it needs to catalyze private sector resources if we're even going to have a dent on the funding requirements. I also believe that for Africa, we need to focus on the opportunities that sustainability brings, because Africa is wealthy in green, wealthy in blue, and I think all of the resources that are important for the transition, most of it will come out of Africa. Cobalt, nickel, and others that will power what I call a zero carbon world. Or maybe net zero carbon, as everybody prefers to say. But I also think that this lecture is important as we prepare for COP27 next month. And I say all this because Standard Chartered focuses on Africa. It focuses on sustainability. and also on innovation. And all of these, I think, are absolutely important for us as we think about how Africa should take that journey of sustainable growth, or financing sustainable growth. Bill Winters, our lecturer, needs no introduction because many of you know of his numerous accomplishments. But I'd like to just say a few words. First, since Bill joined Standard Chartered in June 2015, 7 years ago, Standard Chartered has established itself as a leader on sustainability. I know this firsthand, given my previous role, as Nick mentioned, as a treasurer of the World Bank. And I can attest to his unparalleled commitment also to innovative and responsive finance, especially putting together those solutions for tackling some of the world's most difficult development challenges. Under his leadership, Standard Chartered has committed to reaching net zero carbon emissions from its operations. Can anybody who's not from Standard Chartered tell me by when? 2030. So others are committing to 2050, Standard Chartered is committing by 2030. And they're saying that the companies that they finance should reach net zero by 2050. That needs to be applauded. And I will applaud that. Bill is also the chairman of the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, an initiative to increase trading of voluntary carbon offsets. And he co-founded this in 2020 alongside Mark Carney, the special UN envoy on climate finance. Our lecturer today is also a recipient of the Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire for his services to the economy and to the UK financial services. And he received this in 2013. He's had an exemplary career in finance, including owning his own asset management firm just prior to being at Standard Chartered, but also being in the banking commission, the UK banking commission that was set up post the financial crisis. I can go on and on about Bill's background, but I do want to just say he's also passionate about Africa's development. And of course, he just returned from Kenya, so we're chatting about some of the issues around Kenya. He's also committed to leveraging philanthropy for the good of society. Under his leadership, Standard Chartered has continued to support us at the Royal African Society. Razia Khan, who's on the board of trustees with me, I asked her how long ago have we had the support, and she said probably about 5 or 6 decades from Standard Chartered. But it's been really special in the last few years. I also learned that Bill, because of his love for society, for charity work, that he's deployed his singing skills to raising significant sums of money for charity. So if we have enough time, we may get him to sing as well today. But I'm particularly keen to hear him speak on the financing sustainable growth for Africa. So maybe we'll organize another event where we can all sing and dance, because I know he's also a great dancer. So I'm sure that you'll agree with me that he's an ideal person to give us this lecture today. Following his lecture, I will have a conversation with him on key issues that come out of his lecture. And then after that, we'll have a chance to have questions and comments and answers from participants. So Bill, let me hand over to you without much further ado. Thank you.
Arunma, that was a very kind and probably exceedingly generous introduction, especially as it relates to my singing skills. But I thought I would do the rest of the speech in rap. Is that okay? Seriously. Arunma and I actually, and Senator Charter of the World Bank go back a long way. And I can only echo any praise that came my way in terms of talking about the partnership between the World Bank and between Arunma personally and Senator Charter and the Royal Africa Society, which it has been a fabulous partnership for a very long time. We have some common objectives, but I think we can reflect on the objectives that we've all had and recognize that we haven't accomplished everything that we all set out to accomplish early on. We still have some gaping poverty across the African continent. We have some tremendous incidents of inequality and insecurity, and Africa is going through some tremendous challenges. Africa is also one of the most resilient places I've had the pleasure of working. Many of you, no doubt, have experienced that firsthand and or are intending to. I just came back from Kenya this morning. I spent a couple of days there. It was a real pleasure for me to go into a country that had just successfully accomplished a peaceful transition of power in a very difficult time. And it doesn't mean that there was rancor and disagreement and ongoing uncertainty around the government policies, but the fact that this very major African country has accomplished that transfer of power, it hasn't always been that straightforward in this environment, to me is extremely encouraging. I also found a population, whether these were our clients, corporate clients, retail clients, government officials, central bankers, who were fundamentally optimistic about the prospects for Kenya and for Africa more broadly. Whether that's on the back of the great attributes that we know Africa is carrying, in particular the young and incredibly agile population, but also the healthy endowment of resources and the embedding of a peaceful democratic political process. So challenges are enormous. Opportunities are enormous, and it's a coincidence that I'm here speaking with you tonight, having got off the plane from Kenya this morning. But I do still feel the buzz from what I did. A very interesting, successful, and enlightening trip. But now a little bit about how we're going to fund sustainable growth in Africa. And my comments will focus on sustainability in the broad sense, but also in the specific climate change sense, which I think is it's more than the topic du jour. It's one of these existential issues that we're all facing. Arunma gave some background on Standard Chartered. I think you know that the highlights deeply embedded in Africa for 165 years. The Standard Chartered Bank was actually the Standard Bank of Africa and the Chartered Bank of Asia, both created around 1858, something like that. And the Standard Bank of Africa, I've read the history. You can read the history. There's a book, Crossing Continents. Anybody that wants it, you can have a copy. If you spare. If you're really interested, I'll give it signed for you. But only if you promise to read 1,100 very, very dense pages, no pictures, fine print. But you only have to get about halfway through to realize that the history of Africa, the place, the history of Standard Bank, or not Standard Chartered Bank, are characterized by tremendous booms and busts. All the time, from year to year, booms and busts. Of course, when you talk about Africa, you're talking about many different places. There was always some place that was booming and another place that was busting at any point in time. That's still the case today. Presents particular challenges, also presents great opportunities. But this is the cauldron in which Standard Chartered was formed, and the one that we live in today. So we're deeply committed to Africa. We are arguably the only international bank operating across the continent at this point. Like the African population, we're extremely agile. So we look at our business, we look at our portfolio regularly. We recently announced that we were exiting some of our markets onshore business, in other words, typically the local retail business in a couple of smaller countries in Africa, or some areas where we couldn't add much value. And we've trained all of our guns on the markets where we can have the greatest impact in terms of sustaining the underlying growth momentum of Africa. And that's something that we'll continue to do. In order to get this right, we've got to make our contribution to a sustainable Africa, both with a capital S and a lowercase s, and we can talk about that a little bit. So we know that we're facing an onslaught of challenges right now. Food and energy price inflation have hit the world hard. They're hitting Africa hard. That's coming along with a very strong U.S. dollar. For countries that are importing U.S. dollar-denominated commodities, whether that's fuel or food, recognizing food is roughly 40% of the consumption basket in Africa, this is a tremendous shock to the economy. combined with the after effects of COVID, which we can say Africa has been remarkably resilient in terms of that particular trauma. Likewise, limited direct exposure to the war in Ukraine. But the combination of external shocks has been quite substantial. And it has led to market access issues in a number of African countries. Big question whether they can access financial markets to refinance existing debt. Despite that, growth has exceeded our own expectations in Africa this year. And we think the outlook is relatively strong. And that gets down to these key attributes in Africa, which is the bedding down of democratic institutions. We've seen successful elections in Zambia and Kenya, both of which have been characterized by periods of instability in the past, and bedding down in much of the rest of the continent as well. But we don't take that for granted. We know that things sometimes go in reverse, something that we'll all watch carefully, but so far so good. The demographics are very good. The urbanization trends are supportive of ongoing economic growth, and the role that technology is playing across Africa. I spent a chunk of my morning yesterday with our Standard Chartered Ventures team, which is our innovation lab in Kenya, which is it's the hub for Africa. We've got 5 super interesting, call them fintechs, but startups that are leveraging African technology talent, African business building talent. These are African solutions created by our African colleagues from across the continent. Tremendous impact. Many of you have experienced that firsthand or will when you go back. That's the plan. I've experienced this incredibly dynamic and highly successful ecosystem, which is changing the face of Africa. It gives me as much encouragement as anything else that's going on that Africa can succeed and thrive in the modern economy. So we know, in addition to those exogenous threats, which are reducing the pace of inward investment into Africa, having a further direct impact on the long-term growth potential of the different markets, something that we must watch very, very carefully. These access issues that we talked about. There could be some slower growth that comes in on the back of that, although we haven't seen that as yet. On top of that, we've got the changes and the impact of climate change. Temperatures are in fact rising. We've seen the droughts, we've seen the horrific flooding, not so much in Africa, but in other parts of the world. We know what's coming. No matter what we do today, we're not going to be able to address that temperature change issue quickly enough to keep anyone from being affected. Hopefully we can mitigate the impacts. So we know that while the trajectory is positive, we know that the external shocks are there, and we can expect that they will continue, as has been the case for our 160 years across the continent. We take it as our mission as a bank to help the markets in which we operate to prepare for the shocks that are inevitable and to marshal the investment to generate the long-term sustainable growth that's so important for the ongoing health of the continent. We do that as Standard Chartered by taking a few what we call stands. These are really aspirations that we set out as a bank for the impact that we can have on the communities in which we operate. We try to set these aspirations to be things that go beyond a planning cycle or a budgeting process. They're not really financial aspirations, but we think that they're completely aligned with our financial aspirations. And our stands break into 3 categories. The first is resetting the narrative on globalization. Markets of Africa have been huge beneficiaries of globalization. Arguably, I don't accept the argument, arguably globalization is in reverse. And the world is fragmenting, balkanizing. That isn't actually what the data shows. Trade volumes are continuing to increase. They're just shifting in terms of importance. Of course, the whole China +1, nearshoring, onshoring, friendshoring, whatever you want to call it, it's real. Supply chains are reconfiguring. Africa has a role to play in that. Africa can continue to benefit from globalization, but for all the reasons that globalization is under attack, first and foremost, it left a lot of people behind, and some would argue it encouraged corruption in different parts of the world. Think China Belt and Road state-to-state contracts that were opaque, not always economically driven, gives globalization a bad name. The underlying benefits are real. Our mission as a bank is to identify those good things, those good elements of globalization, to promote those in every possible way, and also to shed a light on the things which are not so good. Allow our customers and our participants in the market to track supply chains, to validate the sustainability and bribery and corruption credentials of the supply chain all the way through the process. so that we can be confident that the effects of globalization are being felt in a positive way, minimizing the negative. That's our first big aspiration. We say, who on earth wants to fight in favor of globalization right now? The answer is we do, because it's extremely important for the markets in which we operate. Our second aspiration and stand is lifting participation. This is dramatically increasing. Our target is to touch the lives of 1 billion people, improving everything from financial literacy to access to financial markets, financial services. We're doing this through some of these fintech type ventures that I talked about, where we're using digital channels to get out to people in both in urban locations but also remotely. We're offering direct financial services, training. We've got a particular focus on small businesses, which are the backbone of the African economies, and many of the other markets in which we operate, and women, and particularly young women. So focusing on education at the earliest. Why women? Because women are underrepresented in the financial sector, certainly in Africa, but also many of our other markets in South Asia, underrepresented for all sorts of historical reasons. And the impact of bringing a woman into the workplace can be 2 to 3 times as impactful as bringing a man into the financial economy. And lifting participation is the second stand of ours. But I'd like to shift now to our third ambition, which is accelerating the race to zero. So getting to this net zero figure that we talked about. We have made a commitment as a bank to achieving net zero by 2050. As you probably know, for a bank, about 95%, but really plus, of the emissions that we take responsibility for are emissions from our clients, and when we're taking our share of those emissions by virtue of our financing relationship with those clients. And the other 5% is our own emissions. And Arunma had mentioned that we will be net zero by 2030. I just, on the spot, I'm going to tell you it's 2025.
Oh, wow.
That's why I'm reading from an iPad, because I haven't touched a piece of paper other than the obvious use in probably 5 years. And we reduced the paper usage of the Standard Charter by about 95%, because you don't actually need paper any longer. We don't need to fly the way we did. We can drive electric vehicles. We can source renewable power, et cetera, et cetera. Right? You're all doing the same thing. We can focus a little bit. Arunma cited a number of the really daunting statistics about the financing gap between the need. You mentioned $1.3 trillion. I think different studies that we said should say across the developing economies, this was probably more like $3.5 trillion of annual financing need just to affect the transition to a net zero carbon economy, and that's every year for the next 30 years. When we look at the available financing, let's say in Europe, Europe has a pretty good idea. They've established a strong taxonomy for a pathway to net zero, and the financing gap is clear, and it's pretty clear where that money is going to come from in terms of public and private sector sources. When you get to sub-Saharan Africa, the amount of financing that's visible and identifiable is less than 10%. So of this 1.5 trillion that Arunma mentioned, less than 10% is identifiable. It doesn't mean it's available. It just means it is identifiable. Arunma also mentioned the amount of public sector funding that is going into the sustainability agenda. That I think you were completely correct for those projects that are non-viable economically. Thankfully, many of the sustainability-related projects, in particular in Africa, are economically viable on their own merits. So the power, to Kenya is 86% renewable power. Now, a lot of that is geothermal power that was installed a long time ago. It's actually quite expensive. But all of that is being replaced with solar and wind that are the cheapest source of power today, or in different markets it's hydro. But it's the cheapest source of power. But nevertheless, despite the fact that these are economically viable projects, there's construction risk, project risk, political risk that's preventing many of those markets from moving at the pace that they economically should move. Good NPV trades, investments as it were. They're not being done because the financing isn't available for a plethora of reasons. And I think there's a few absolutely critical steps that we need to take to address this. First is creating a set of standards so that the banks like Standard Chartered that have made a commitment to getting us and our clients to net zero, do that in a way that's understood, validated, and accepted. So we need standards. We need agreed standards and an agreed understanding. Second is we need to meld public and private sector funding. Today we get about $9 billion of multilateral development bank financing into sustainable projects per year. Now, you guys can do the math. 9 billion as a percentage of 1.5 trillion or 3.5 trillion is basis points. This is nothing. So in other words, the MDBs are falling massively short of the requirement. The figure that's as concerning to me is that for every dollar that the World Bank puts into a sustainable financing project, they're crowding in 95 cents of private sector money. 95 cents. Now, what's the right answer? The 9 billion should be at least 15 times that amount, 15 times. How's the World Bank going to increase their lending for sustainable projects by 15 times? They're going to have to go to their shareholders. Who's the biggest shareholder? The United States, 25% of the budget, right? Still 25%? 25% of the budget. You watch the politics. Is the US going to contribute an additional $100 billion to the World Bank to fund the sustainable program that's absolutely critical? Not in the near future, right? So we should not give up this fight, right? If we believe in this cause, we must be agitating our governments to put the money into the MDBs because they're in the best position to have the greatest impact on the climate fight. The second challenge is to get that 95 cents, so basically 1 to 1, $1 of MDB money, $1 of private sector. That should be 15 to 1. How do you get that down? Well, the MDBs are going to have to take more risk. Right? They should be taking the first loss tranche, the equity tranche. If you're studying financial capital markets theories, then you know what that means. If you're not, you can figure it out. Right? If you take more risk, you can bring other people in on top of you. That's not what happens today. The World Bank and the IFC, the African Development Bank, are in many ways competing against the private sector. They're not providing leveraging capital or catalyzing capital, they're providing substitute capital at a lower cost. That's missing the point. So we've got to get those two things right. Third is we have to co-opt the capital markets. Now, we've got less than 2% of the money under management by the 300 largest asset managers in the world. Less than 2% is targeted ESG financing, right? Broadly ESG, not even just sustainability. They won't invest a penny if the product that they're investing in isn't standardized. And if they don't understand, because it's been validated by some third party, that this is good stuff. In order for it to be identified as good stuff, it needs to be standardized and rated. Right? So we've got to put the infrastructure in place to allow this huge pool of non-bank capital market money to come to bear. Again, the MDBs can play a role in that, the banks can play a role in that, the governments can play a role in that through standardization, validation, and regulation. So if we get those things right, my bet is we can get the amount of money that's necessary for our African markets to transition to net zero. It will have a dramatic impact on GDP. Just going to read off a few figures. So the total that we calculate is necessary for the developing markets, of which Africa is a big chunk, is about $95 trillion between now and net zero. If we forced, not that we could, but if we forced the developing economies to fund that themselves, it would have a contractionary impact on GDP of about 5%. Right? It would reduce the household consumption power by about 25%. First of all, it's not going to happen because no government does that to its people. But secondly, it's completely unfair, given the problem that we're asking the African markets to solve. It's a problem that's not very big. Africa is only 2% of global emissions, and obviously a tiny proportion of cumulative emissions today. On the other hand, if we have that 90, let's call it $85 billion, not even funded by developing countries, the impact on jobs in Africa will be a dramatic positive. You'd have an increase in GDP relative to the baseline of 3.1%. You'd have an increase in global GDP of 2% because of the impact of this investment that is the highest impact investment that we can make. Because it's the investment that, in the absence of having made that investment, wouldn't be made at all. And we'd have the climate change consequence as a result. So the economic case for the developed world, funding the developing world undertaking in sustainable finance, it's overwhelming. The economics. The ethical arguments are even more overwhelming. But we're not doing it. Why are we not doing this? It can only be short-termism, selfishness, and politics. Right? So we say that here sitting in LBS and the Royal African Society because we're supposed to challenge these things. When society is going the wrong way for the wrong reasons to get a wrong outcome, you're supposed to challenge things. That's what I'm trying to do in every forum I have. That's what I would ask you to do. This is an imperative. It's a good thing for Africa if we get this right. It's a good thing for the world, and it's a good thing for the United States and the United Kingdom, the rest of the EU, China, Japan, etc. So with that, I will probably overrun my time anyway, but thank you very much for listening, and look forward to having a chat.
That was a lot of food for thought, Bill. And what I will do is first ask you a few questions myself and have a conversation with you. But before that, I wanted to just ask people to start thinking about the questions that they would like to ask, all the comments, because it would be lovely if we have as many people as possible contribute. Please keep your comments, your questions concise, so that we can have as many people as possible contribute. Introduce yourself first, then make your comment or ask your question. Please, I'm a very polite person, so don't let me have to stop you. So please try to disrespect the rules up front. And remember, I used to be a regulator as well. So I do know how to use a carrot and a stick at the same time. But Bill, thank you for such a phenomenal lay of the land. First, you talked about the exogenous issues. You then talked about some of what Africa needs to do. And I like your practice of aspirations. And I like, of course, that net zero is one of the aspirations, and you're leading in that regard. So I do want to ask you a few other questions to help me understand better some of the issues you've talked about. So you mentioned sustainability. People often ask the question, is being sustainable profitable? Is there a difference between sustainability and development? So if you can just share a few thoughts.
It's a really important question, and sustainability means so many different things. Obviously, frequently today the term is referring to climate change and sustainable investments, but at the root, sustainable means it carries on. It's self-sustaining, or it can carry on under its own power. And from our perspective, if we aren't practicing a business at full scale, where we can have an impact on the markets where we operate, and if that isn't paying for itself along the way, then it's going to be limited in terms of the impact. So, of course, we run a business. I always feel a little bit grubby when I talk about this, because the fact is we will make money by providing this sustainable financing. We make money when we underwrite bonds for the World Bank, or when we put together a MEGA guaranteed project in Zambia. I would like to say that we always focus on making a fair amount of money, but we make money, and that's a good thing. We shouldn't be ashamed or concerned about that, because without making money, we can't put all the resources that we need to into it. So we made a public ambition of generating income for our bank of $1 billion in 5 years in sustainable finance. My comments a little bit less formally than that we should be making $2 billion over unspecified time frame, 5, 6, 7 years, which would be about 10% of our income. Is it unreasonable, given the markets where we operate in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, that 10% of our profits or 10% of our income should come from the most fundamental shift in the nature of our economies that we've seen in our lifetime? No. In areas where we happen to be quite good? No, I think that's quite reasonable. But we also recognize there's an obligation. Yes, this is a business for us. But our undertaking to achieve net zero by 2050 has nothing to do with profitability. In fact, it will be quite expensive to do that. We have very healthy debates on our board. Is the profit that you generate through this phenomena going to be greater or less than the cost? I can tell you that the people who look at our shares have concluded that it's a cost, that it's going to cost us more than we make. I actually think they're wrong. I think if we do this right, if we have the impact that I think we can have in Africa, in South Asia, in ASEAN, I think we could generate actually more profit. And that profit's all going to go back into making our business better. So, it's got to be sustainable. Is it going to be net costly? Probably, but I hope not.
But I liked your point earlier around that Africa offers you the opportunity to be sustainable and also do well. So on Africa, one of my biggest challenges is with the net zero agenda is really the energy poverty that Africa has. So there's probably almost 800 million Africans who have no access to electricity. And Africa has been known to emit the lowest in terms of carbon emissions. And with industrialization, you need electricity. With education, you need electricity. With health, you need electricity. What is your view on what that path should be? So if you were the president of Nigeria, what would you do?
We've got an election coming up. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, this can be turned good.
No, the power deficit is enormous in Africa, and I should have mentioned in my comments that the core to our sustainability strategy is a just transition. And just transition means we have a healthy respect both for the economic growth objective as well as the transition to a net zero carbon environment. That's very controversial, right? I mean, there's a large school of thought that I'm sure shows up in this lecture from time to time that thinks that there is no fossil fuel that's a good fossil fuel, and it should all be gone tomorrow. And that's a lovely idea, and we would definitely achieve net zero pretty quickly. We achieve net zero in a lot of ways, including tolerance with the population, but up with the lack of economic opportunity. So we've got to get that balance right. As a bank, likely, and certainly Africa as a continent, emissions will go up before they go down. We can still get to net zero by 2050. We can still consume only the allowed carbon budget over that time. But given you've got underlying growth rates of 4, 5, 6% across many African markets, and we'll obviously see how that all plays out through this period right now. But you have good underlying economic growth and a huge power deficit that is largely fossil fuel generated today. There's going to be an increase before there's a decrease. The key is to make the big investments right now in renewable power, in better manufacturing processes, in better agricultural processes that will drive that curve down in the subsequent years. And I believe, in fact, all the modeling that we've done says that we can achieve our net zero emissions, which is a 45% reduction in our financed emissions by 2030, and then 100% by 2050. And we can achieve that while supporting economic growth at every step along the way. But it requires really quite precise planning. And if you get off a little bit on that timeline, then of course the whole line shifts and the world gets into trouble. So
What do you think about gas as transition?
it's inevitable and it's absolutely necessary. And that's the whole point of a transition is that, and as I mentioned, if you look at the International Energy Agency's scenario planning, for example, in their net zero pathway, they have Africa increasing their emissions before reducing. Some of those increases most of those increases are coming from new installation of gas rather than oil, and in many cases displacing coal with gas. But net, there's still a small increase in emissions in the first 2 or 3 years because of the underlying growth and the power deficit. As you mentioned, that growth is much more energy intensive than is the case in Europe or the United States or even China for that matter. So that's gas is an essential transition fuel. Oil is also an essential transition fuel from coal. So, and I don't think we should shy away from that, but it's a very unpopular thing to say in some circles.
So would you elect him as president of Nigeria? The elections are coming up on the 25th of February next year. It's a very pragmatic view of the world and realistic view. So now I'm switching to my love for the multilaterals, and you pretty much told us that the development banks are not living up to expectations. They're not putting in as much money into the continent, and they're not catalyzing as many resources. So if you were the president of the new MDB, what would you do differently?
I'd be going to my shareholders and asking for an increase in capital, roughly doubling of the capital. And I would ask for a license to increase my funding for sustainable projects by 15 times. And I would be telling them the expected loss on those projects is going to increase from approximately zero. The expected loss on a rollback loan is approximately zero today because they're always the first to get paid back. To say actually the expected loss is going to be more like 6 or 7%, which is the loss rate that you would expect if you're taking the risky tranche of financing especially in the developing economy. So that's a big change. That's a big change. Some would say it's a different mandate than the mandate that an MDB has ever had before. But we've got an existential threat out there, and existential threats demand existential responses, and that would be our response.
Wow. Are there any shareholder representatives in the room? I like that. I can see my vice chair, Jide Onarawaju, who's TPG, and he's probably familiar with taking more risk than the MPPs do. So it's music to his ears, I'm sure. Maybe I should ask you about COP27. Do you think COP27 is going to be successful? What is your criteria for assessing success? What would success mean for you for COP27?
Yeah, I think to dive into COP27, you need to reflect briefly on COP26. And so, was COP26 successful? Yeah, I think yes, in a number of regards. For starters, I think there was a tremendous private sector contribution to COP26 that had been missing in earlier years. It had been largely a public sector forum. I think there was the seeds or the foundations of a really healthy working relationship between the public and the private sector. Although I can say that having been in Glasgow and felt at the beginning of that process, it felt slightly antagonistic. Thinking, well, what are these private sector people doing coming here telling us how to do our jobs? And we said, we're not telling you how to do your job, we're just asking, in fact, we're begging you, just do your job. So what did we come out the back end of COP26 with? I think good momentum, some good frameworks, and a lot of missing definition, and a lot of missing money. And I was in Vietnam a few weeks ago. I followed a certain very important climate change guy from the United States. In each of the meetings I had, I was following after that former presidential candidate, and he really pumped up the crowd. I mean, the Prime Minister was so excited that the United States was going to help Vietnam with its enormous transition plan to net zero. And I said, that's great. I'm also very excited about that. Did you write a check? Did he even suggest that there might be a check forthcoming? And the answer was, of course, no. So it comes down to the money in a lot of cases. So I think COP26, good foundation, some detail missing, money definitely missing. So what would be a good COP27? Ongoing focus on public-private partnerships, because I don't think either of the two sectors can do it alone. Together we can. Get specific. Some of it's very technical. Article 6, right? We all declared victory on Article 6, which is the way that the national accounting reconciles with voluntary carbon markets. Detail not worked out. So we haven't gotten the traction on that we need. Get the detail. And then, please deliver the money and deliver it with enough certainty that the private sector can come in and really provide that 70, 80, 90% of the financing that needs to come from the private sector, but properly catalyzed by the public sector.
So I'll ask you one last question, and I'll ask people to start to be ready. I think we have 4 roving mics. Oh, I see that there are several hands up already. So we're going to take it by section. So we'll start from that section, and the next section, and that's 1, and 4 sections. And then we'll take 4 questions, and then we may take another round, because I think we're at 7 p.m. already. So my final question is about the work that you're doing in the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets. I think it's an absolutely phenomenal initiative, particularly for Africa. So I'd like to just hear your thoughts as to where you are and what we need to do to really scale voluntary carbon markets.
Thanks for asking. The task force, as the name suggests, started as a task force. There were 450 members from all walks of life. So big emitters like the oil companies and airlines, all the big NGOs that are serious in the space, academics, intermediaries, banks. And the mission was, the belief was that if you harness the power of markets, we can get tens, eventually hundreds of billions of dollars into the hands of people that can actually get the carbon out of the environment. The easiest way to do that is to protect the existing carbon sinks, which are our forests, and typically concentrated in the Congo Basin and in the Amazon Basin and in the forests of Indonesia, Borneo, and Kalimantan. So those are the biggest reservoirs by far, and they're burning. You know, the Amazon is a net emitter of carbon now. It's just unbelievable. This thing that was the biggest absorber of carbon is now a net emitter because more is being burned than is being absorbed. Right? We can bribe the Brazilians and their friends to stop burning down the Amazon, right? But and you do that with carbon credits. You might not like it, but it's better than watching it burn. So the problem is the market was characterized by a lack of confidence that these projects were actually making a difference. Greenwashing, concerns about greenwashing. Most projects were fine, right, with the benefit of hindsight. Some were bad, and bad obviously takes the whole thing. So we said we're going to set some very high standards that everybody can agree to, backed by a group of scientific experts, all uninvolved in anything that is making money. Right? These are independent academics and experts. Set high standards and then put a governance framework around that. That means that those standards can evolve through time as science changes, as the understanding changes. And we codified that in it's called the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets. It's a proper board of directors. It's dominated by academics and NGOs, but with some market expertise, advised by a group of experts, and their recommendations are out for consultation right now, and will be codified sometime between now and the end of the year. If we do this, our bet is that we can get upwards of $100 million into the hands of typically emerging markets countries to protect their existing carbon sinks, but also to properly incentivize investments into carbon-reducing technologies, carbon-improving processes, always in situations where, but for the existence of the carbon credit, it wouldn't have happened, right? And that's one of the key criteria. It has to be additional. And so when we get that right, it's just one more tool in the quiver to get money into the hands of people that can make a difference.
I'm hoping, for the sake of DRC and many other forests that are great carbon sinks in Africa, that we can have that market really take off. And also be a way to help the really poor people in many of those countries. I have so many more questions, and I see people are roaring to go, so we will get started. So my colleagues who have the mic, will decide whom to give it. So one here, one here, one here. So we take 4, then I hope that's 5, and then we'll take another 4, and then Nick and Tia will get to decide whether we close at that point or have another chance. So please go ahead.
Thank you. Arunma from Bloomberg Institute in London, Education Institution. I wanted to pick up on the discussion at the World Trade Organization last week in Geneva, the Economic Forum. There was some discussion there about aid and trade. So I want to ask you, the question is around what do you feel, given the challenges you've outlined in terms of sustainable finance, what do you feel we can do in terms of the diaspora? And I asked this with 2 reference points. One is aid for trade, where governments are getting a bit savvy about how they can channel that for trade. But the other obvious reference point is 65 years after Ghana's independence, we're seeing a different generation in terms of diaspora and advantages of technology. So how can the diaspora play a more focused role in terms of that and the potential and the pathway for the diaspora and the challenges it can pose? Thank you.
Sorry, you're asking about the diaspora.
Correct.
Which diaspora?
Well, the African diaspora.
Around the world.
Around the world.
Okay.
Can we take like
Yeah.
4 together, because that would help us in managing, or help me in managing the time. Can we have the mics ahead of time? It will help me as well. So there's somebody, please go ahead. Please go ahead, yes.
Hi, nice to meet you both. So I'm Stella. I work in commercial finance in a company called Kingfisher. So they're the headquarters for some big DIY companies around the world. In the UK, it's B&Q and Screwfix. So we're sustainability targets. We also have a target of net zero. And because it's a retail company, it's more focused on the supply chain, who we have as our suppliers and where we get our materials from. So as Standard Chartered is a bank, what kind of factors do you focus on when it comes to achieving those targets? So obviously it's quite different industries, so I would like to know a bit more about that. Thank you.
Someone from here. Can we get the microphones to people ahead of time? I'm trying to monitor this. Sorry, we were doing it different parts of the room. So, and there's a woman who's been raising her hand in the middle. And can we give the fourth person a microwave? That's not a microwave, microphone. Every person needs a microwave. Please go ahead.
Hi there, my name's Carly Lung. I'm a corporate lawyer working for an American law firm. I wanted to ask you, so Africa is a huge continent, right? And so within each sort of African jurisdiction, how are the governments aligning with their approach to actually governing or, complying with ESG obligations? And in particular, how are they going to manage governing the value chain, the downstream? Because often these supply chains downstream are smaller third parties who may get away with doing certain things. So how does Standard Chartered do their own due diligence in the downstream supply chain, and generally how are governments aligning their approach?
The next person, please.
Yeah, hi, my name is Sami Khan. I'm from British Investment International. I'm here with a few colleagues. Questions basically around food security, and I think you all touched upon this very important issue of food security. I think in the case of Africa, it's quite evident that food security preceded the crisis that's happening in Ukraine and will continue to take place. Given the fact in Africa you have a lot of fragmented farm holdings, 80% of the farmers in Africa are smallholders. Obviously, we need to look at long-term solutions, long-term holistic solutions rather than band-aid solutions. Of course, those so-called band-aid short-term solutions are very much required. They could be to assist trade flow, market access. But I would like to understand, how, as you know, British Investment International recognizes the oldest impact investor in a number of quarters, and we've been involved in Africa for quite a long time. We want to see how is it possible for Standard Chartered to work with the likes of organizations like us in terms of creating sustainable development impact in, say, sectors like food and agriculture to address food security by deploying patient capital, but more importantly, using Standard Chartered's reach on the offtake. You talked about voluntary carbon markets, and there's a huge opportunity for agriculture to tap the voluntary carbon markets, given the fact that only 1% of global market voluntary carbon markets are used by agriculture. So it's a huge offtake, and I understand that Standard Chartered is setting up a sort of a carbon exchange in Southeast Asia. In Singapore. Actually, Singapore is where I'm from, but I'm very passionate about what's happening on the ground as far as development impact is concerned. So my question is basically, how could like-minded organizations such as British International Investment partner with the likes of Standard Chartered? Since you have such a global footprint, you're both involved in impact capital, but also on the offtake market.
Bill got a sense of your question. I can see you're very passionate. So Bill, I'll hand back to you. There are 4 questions, one about the diaspora, Africans, the other about how do you really do ESG, or these
are great questions. Maybe I could start.
With the last one?
Yes, I'll start with, I think the diaspora question and the agriculture question they have a connection. Of course, agriculture is the largest employer in Africa. It's not the highest earner, but it's the highest employer. And of course, you're right, up to 80% of farms being smallholders. Begs the question, like every other industry that's fragmented or disintegrated, is there a technology solution that helps us? So the obvious is you jump to collective farming or large-scale industrial farming, which isn't practical in the short term in Africa. It's neither practical nor politically feasible. Perhaps I'll give you, this is a tiny micro example, and it is a Standard Chartered example. I spent an hour yesterday morning, as I mentioned, with our innovation lab. One of the ventures that we've got going is an ag-tech venture, it's agricultural technology. And the specific objective, one of my colleagues is a farmer. She was tremendously frustrated by how difficult it was to get her smallholder produce from her family farm to market. Middlemen, booms and busts in terms of demand for a particular product, almost impossible for a smallholder to tap into the export market without giving up well over 100% of any profit margin that they might have hoped for. So we've developed a tech platform that's just a marketplace for the smallholder farmer that allows them to effectively participate through an auction mechanism with other smallholders, effectively getting the benefits of some collective bargaining and accessing end markets without intermediaries who were taking all of the value in that chain and driving the smallholder out of existence, driving them back into existence farming and just for their own families. Can you scale that up to the point where you can actually take the smallholder farming segment and make it efficient overall to increase food security for the country? Yeah, I think that with a lot of other investments of that type can make exactly the difference that we need. It's just an example that I would support that. What's the role of the diaspora? Well, they're going to own those platforms, right? I mean, the African diasporas, some of you are in this room, educated, you maybe perhaps been involved in technology ventures outside of Africa, a huge impetus for technical innovation in our African business. It's coming from Africans who have spent some time outside the country. I'll say a lot is coming from Africans who have never left their own country. There's a latent entrepreneurism that is not fully exploited or tapped into. But I think that it's a combination of money, expertise, and passion for the market, and we must tap into that. Now, it was fascinating for me to watch in the past. I've been a senator for 7 years, but I've been operating in China one way or the other for 30 years. To watch the Chinese diaspora retarget onto China, and many retargeted onto China from Silicon Valley or Silicon Lens or Wall Street, but many went back to China. And I have no doubt, well, some of that is already happening in Africa. I have no doubt that there will be much more, and that hopefully we can harness that not just the money but the brains, and deliver that whole package. The question on how do we assess ESG commitments? How are they aligned with government undertakings? And I think that also relates through to supply chains. And it's a fascinating set of challenges. As you may have gathered from my comments, I'm disinclined to rely primarily on governments to solve our problems. It just doesn't work a lot of the time. There are great exceptions. Europe has made tremendous strides on the sustainability front, and it's entirely a global issue. So governments can get it right, but I think if we rely exclusively on governments, we're going to be in trouble. But what are the pressure points on corporations around the world to get green? Well, one pressure point is, in some cases, is governments and regulation. Almost always not the case. With the exception of Europe, maybe a little bit in China now. You may say the EPA regulations in the US are driving that way, but we know those go up and down depending on the political wind. That the rest of the world is pretty much going on their own. But governments are one source. The second source is finance. Standard Chartered and every other bank has ESG policies now. And we're enforcing those on our clients. We say if you don't have a credible net zero transition plan, we can't bank you. We'll help you if you have one, and we'll finance it. We've set aside $300 million in financing for exactly that purpose. But if you don't have a plan, then we're not going to be able to bank you. Even more important than finance is the supply chain. So if you're exporting to Unilever or Nestle or Johnson & Johnson or Siemens or General Motors, and you don't have a credible net zero transition plan, you're not going to sell your product. Forget about financing or whether you have to pay an extra percentage point on financing. You're not going to sell your product at all. And that's that combination of pressure from government, strong in some cases, weak in others, very weak in most developing economies, truth be told. But the pressure from governments, the pressure from finance, and the pressure from the supply chain, those three things, it's a pincer movement. And the cumulative effect is that no company, I mean virtually no company on the planet, can ignore the obligation to achieve net zero. We track that as a bank extremely carefully. I mean, there isn't a conversation I have with a corporate client that doesn't involve, can you please share with me? In fact, I don't have to ask, they tell me, let's talk about your net zero transition plan, because they know we're judging that. And they know that if they make a compelling case, they're going to get money from us. And if they don't make a compelling case, we're going to ask for our money back. It's that straightforward. Maybe that gets to the factors that we consider in making decisions as well. Did I cover the question?
You did. So we'll take another 4, one from each section. And can we just get the microphones to people quickly? Because I think I stand between you and the cocktail. Is what I see. Please go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you very much for a very informative lecture. It's amazing how we come from different directions. If I agree with you on
Please introduce yourself first before.
lifted participation, creating a set of standards, and the standardizing financial instruments, I think are very important. One precondition I think you didn't actually, or you haven't, it's not in your mind, that it's in mine, is the education of the African elites in the countries to treat their pause in action according to the Declaration of Human Rights, rather than as pawns for personal profit as they've done over the last 50 years. In particular, I'm talking about over 40% of Africa's wealth is abroad. I read an article which says that when aid gets to Africa within the next year, their net outflows. What mechanisms, standards, or values can be put in place to prevent this?
So did I miss you introducing yourself?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
okay, I'm Carl Miller, formerly of an organization called Arms Reduction Coalition.
Thank you. Sorry, if somebody has the microphone, can you go?
Yeah,
Please go ahead.
my name is Adi Kushu and I'm a student of development, development planning and finance. I have a particular interest in energy, and so I'm asking my question from two perspectives. One, recognizing the value of community-led initiatives. We see examples in Thailand, we also see examples here in the UK. We had a visit to Liverpool and we could see community-led initiatives and the impact of what they've done to build houses for people who can't afford homes in Liverpool. The second perspective I have is recognizing opportunities for energy access or improving energy access by using microgrids and that sort of decentralization, and also recognizing opportunities for this sort of energy democracy where houses can generate their own energy and of course feed that back into the grids. I'm asking, how do you work with communities where they create these sort of initiatives? And what sort of issues have you encountered in your experience if you have had such opportunities to work with such communities? Thank you.
Who's got the next microphone? My team needs to help me get microphones.
Hello, yeah.
Please go ahead.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. You alluded to this debate around globalization, if it is receding or not, and you suggested that those who know the benefits of globalization should stand up and say that loud and proud. And you alluded also to the impact this has in terms of the willingness of large major donor countries to donate in the rates that they should. But of course, it's not only in the so-called global north that there's skepticism around the shared benefits of globalization. And 2 days ago in Burkina Faso, there was a successful military coup, the third successful military coup in that region of the world in the last 12 months. And the intense anti-French feeling which is felt in this part of the world is not only linked to military engagement of France in Mali, but it's linked to the sense that French multinational companies are benefiting disproportionately, and that, as kind of popular songs from the region say, you know, our cities are becoming beautiful, but we're still poor. So this growth, which is happening with the help of some of the types of initiatives that you allude to, is not in the eyes of a large part of the population being fairly shared. So I guess the question is, should this only be the responsibility of the state to ensure that these kinds of investments are just? Should banks be allowed to just get on with the business of making money? Or is there actually some social responsibility in addition to the environmental responsibility to which you allude? And what are the kind of standards which need to be put in place to ensure that that is more systematically followed? Thank you.
So we need the two more. Yes, please go ahead.
My name is Sokwa from Marathon. So thank you very much for the discussion. And I think it was really to kind of look at the question around the conundrum. For example, you know, you alluded to the fact that only, let's say, 1 to 2% of global capital flows go to emerging markets, but in essence, that's what we know the growth is going to be over the next 20 to 30 years. But in essence, if you look at investors over the last 20 years, the area that's had the most transformative growth has been China. Investors haven't necessarily made that much money, but obviously the corporates, with BMW, Louis Vuitton, they made a ton of money, but from an investor perspective, that hasn't manifested itself in terms of returns. And how do you explain that, Kanan?
And then one last one. Who has the microphone? You've been raising, okay, so I'll grant one extra one after the person gets a microphone, because he's been raising his hand from the very beginning. So can somebody get a microphone to him?
Hello. Thank you. Hello, my name is Sonny Ojaga, business owner at Canary Wharf. And my question has to do with global governance across sectors, but most especially finance and economy, since that's why we are here. Mr. Bill, how do you ensure African development process when we see major efforts for decades, of an industrialized Africa being undermined by a global governance, And we've seen that a lot of efforts are made, a lot of money pumped into the economy, but if you don't reform the global system, the global governance system that was put in place in 1945, right now African youth, it's completely obsolete, because if you don't change the way this global governance does operate, it becomes very difficult to really bring about change in Africa. So lastly, about net zero, don't you think that the pressure to achieve net zero should be more applied on developed countries, especially the G7 and the G20, while Africans can pursue their development process? Thank you.
Thank you. Simon Tahuja, Head of Impact on Impactor and Alum of the School. Well, my question is on technology absorption capacity in Africa, and I don't mean e-commerce. I mean engineering technology, whether related to water, energy, waste, transport. We run a portfolio of 50 plus highly disruptive technologies, and we find that the absorption rate is much higher in Asia and LATAM than in Africa. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The cost of solar in parts of LATAM and parts of South Asia is 3, 4, 5 cents a kilowatt hour, and it's still 5-6 times in Africa. Why is that? Solar has been long developed. Cost of water is 25 cents a cubic meter, still 5 times in Africa. So why is the technology absorption capacity so poor? When we bring technologies to Africa, we're told, don't show me the tech is working in Lilongwe, not in London. Right? And there's got to be a pool of capital available to put that first commercial demonstrator. We don't find that challenge elsewhere in the world, but in Africa particularly, we find that a huge problem.
That's a broad range of questions, but I think we can group them into a few things. There were, if I could paraphrase the questions, the first one was, how can we expect to succeed when we have this, when governance is poor and corruption is high? I think that's the paraphrase. A couple of the questions. And then the implicit question / criticism was, and what are you doing about it? Which is very fair. I'm not sure how much of the issue is governance, but there's tremendous leakage in many of the African markets, whether that's the corruption or you've got funds that are being offshored. More than 60% leakage rate in water systems in Nairobi, compared to an expected 2 or 3% leakage in, let's say, in the UK, and we complain about these a lot here. These are fundamentally governance questions, and if the heart, I don't think a bank is going to solve those, but banks have an extremely important role to play. For starters, the fight against financial crime, so bribery, anti-bribery and corruption, or another version of financial crime, which is enforcing sanctions, which you may like or don't like, but it's a key part of my life, I can tell you. Enforcing sanctions levied by the UK, the US, the EU, or China on adversaries, most recently on Russia. These are very effective tools, but the burden for enforcing these sanctions is on us. The burden for tracking illicit funds is overwhelmingly with the banking system. It's not law enforcement. We do the work, we make the reports to law enforcement. They retrieve about 1% of the ill-gotten gains, so that 99% of the proceeds of financial crime are never recovered. 1% is recovered. We as a bank, we're not allowed to say how many suspicious activity reports we file every year, but suffice it to say there's some hundreds of thousands. How many of those are acted on by law enforcement around the world? I'm guessing it's a fraction of a percentage point, maybe a fraction of a basis point that's actually being acted on. So this is banks have a key role to play in interdicting illicit flows, and we take that extremely seriously. I tell you that it's about 15% of the operating expense of my company is doing the bidding of law enforcement, right? Because that's our job. If you get a bank license, that's what you do, and we take it extremely seriously. And if we get it wrong, we pay millions of dollars in fines, which is part of the reason I'm in the job that I'm in, because my company got it wrong in 2012. We paid millions of dollars in fines. The CEO got fired, so did the chairman, so did the entire board of directors, and everybody that worked for them. And I came in and got to start all over again. It was 160-year-old bank. So we take it extremely seriously. We take the governance of the companies and the governments in which we operate extremely seriously. We also know that we can't issue a diktat. We can't tell a government to change its policies. What we can do is say, if you do it this way, life is going to be a little bit better than if you do it that way. And we're very reluctant to leave a country because governments come and go, governance comes and goes, social policies, economic policies, political policies come and go. We've been in the markets where we operate for 160 years, and we think we're a force for good. It doesn't mean that everything that happens in every market in which we operate is good. It's not. Right? There's bad things happening all the time. This is a challenge that we face every day. But to the, is it possible? You talk about educating the African elite or complying with the Declaration of Human Rights. We 100% align with the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And we've got policy statements as long as you're on that say exactly how we're.
I think you need to raise your voice.
Sorry, get the microphone back out. Sorry about that. So to completely agree with the need for banks and everybody else in the private sector, together with the citizenry of the countries, to focus on human rights and complying with undertakings that these governments have made. And we should be using the economic tools at our disposal to enforce that. We talked about globalization being unfair. That was my point, really. Globalization has been unfair. While it's lifted probably 2 million people out of poverty, it's left some of those very same people behind in other ways, human rights being the most obvious one in some cases. The rights of indigenous populations in many cases have been trampled. Biodiversity in many cases has been trampled, which has much more substantial consequences long term. So globalization has not been perfect. Our whole objective in resetting the narrative on globalization is to say, hey, let's understand what's been good about globalization and what's been bad. Let's be very honest about that. And if it's bad, let's figure out how we're going to measure it, track it, and address it. Right? And we, as a society, we can do that if we're serious about it. But if you say globalization is bad, right, ab initio, you never get to the discussion about how you make it good. Right? So I completely agree with the point. And my point is this is what we're trying to tackle. And this is absolutely the responsibility both of governments and the private sector, including banks. We talked about global governance. I think when you talk about 1945, you must be referring to like the Bretton Woods system and the World Bank and IMF, and I guess that's what you're referring to. I don't think that's the root of the problem in Africa. I don't think that's the root of the problem today. We can debate whether the way the World Bank is set up is optimal. I've been quite challenging with the role that the World Bank and other MDBs play in terms of supporting a transition. But I think it would be a bit of a cop-out to say that the world is rigged against the developing countries because of some agreements that were made in 1945. But maybe you've got a point and we should look, what precisely do we think is not working and how can we address that?
He also had the second question, which is an interesting one, whether Africa should be given a different path.
I was,
So sorry to interrupt. What is not working is the debt process. How the World Bank processes the debt, how the indebted African countries and how they process all those things. I'll give you a practical example.
I'm sorry, we have cocktail coming on, so you can have a conversation and Bill and I had a conversation beforehand around the World Bank. I have a different view. I obviously love the World Bank itself as well, so let's keep to the rules. Part of, you're trying to advocate for global governance, let's keep to the rules in this room.
the second part of your question, which was shouldn't G7 countries be paying a disproportionate share of the cost? And I thought it was really clear. Absolutely, and a big chunk of that can go through the MDBs, can go through the World Bank. The World Bank is funded by the U.S. and other developed countries, and I'm suggesting strongly that those developed countries not just provide the funding, but expect to take some losses on that funding as well. Otherwise, one, it won't work. Right? There just isn't enough money without that happening. But two, it's not fair. So I think you can completely agree with that point. Maybe it's two other points. The returns in emerging markets are lacking. It's a really interesting point because I know what you're referring to is financial investments and stock market valuations and debt market returns, which have in aggregate probably not hit the risk-adjusted returns of developed markets over the past 30 years. They far exceeded the returns of the previous 30 years for what it's worth. So maybe we're in super cycles. If you look at the returns on the ground, the returns in operating businesses, the returns have been phenomenal in the private sector, but those aren't captured in those macro statistics that you mentioned. So you mentioned BMW and others who have made a lot of money in China. Well, they've got a business on the ground. They make cars, and they make a lot of cars. In fact, I think Volkswagen makes over half their cars in China. And it's Apple, as we know, sells a third of its phones in China. These are phenomenally profitable countries. So to properly capture the returns in emerging markets, we'd have to look at what proportion of I don't even know what Apple's worth these days, $2 trillion, probably less to say, but what proportion of that trillions of dollars is coming from its emerging market franchise? It's a meaningful proportion. And I think that I'm trying to make the case for investing in emerging markets, just doing it in the right way. And buying equities may not be the only way to do that. And then this tech absorption point, I mean, you know this, you know the answer better than I do. I can tell by the way you asked the question. But so why is technology less readily absorbed in some African markets than others? I don't know. It probably gets back to some of those governance questions that we were talking about. It probably gets back to regulation to some extent. I don't believe that there's an underlying lack of receptivity to technology innovations. And what I see in the finance sector, which I do see very directly, the technical innovations that we might initiate in China or Singapore or Europe are applied in Africa in astoundingly fast and effective ways. And we're running now 9 digital banks in Africa, in 9 different markets, digital only. We've added 1 million customers in 18 months, which is a little bit more than all the customers that we added in the previous 159 years. So the digital revolution is very, very real in Africa, and the adoption is extremely fast in some sectors. But the finance sector is one where governments have said, we actually want this digital innovation. We're going to support it. We're going to support it with regulation. And we're going to encourage both banks and non-banks to compete. And maybe in some of these other sectors, you're not getting the same government tailwind, but I'm guessing. But it's a great challenge.
Wow. I have one question that I would like to ask you. So it's great to be able to I can ask you that last question. But the reason I ask it is that I do think that whether it's sustainability or just net zero more generally, that we all must reflect on what we're doing as individuals. Can you share an example with us of what you do yourself? You did share one. You operate paperless. This is my old Standard Chartered notebook that I got from you educate young leaders.
It's grandfathered.
Yeah, but you educate young leaders at Oxford, and you give them this notebook. So I got one because I was one of the people who share them. But something else other than that you do, just so that we ourselves can think about what are we doing. in this agenda to next year?
Look, one thing I do, and I hope it's impactful, but you'll be the judge of that, is I talk about it a lot. And I really believe that we can make a difference. So I hope that by talking about the things that we're doing as a company, it's making a difference. I hope that's the biggest thing that I do. Obviously, we're putting money behind it. It's not my money, it's the bank's money, but it's, I'm the custodian of that money, and we're putting a lot of money behind this agenda. On a personal level, I'm doing like little things like flying less. It doesn't mean I travel less. It means that I go for fewer trips where I stay longer, which I can do because my kids have left the house, although one of them is sitting in the back there. But harder for somebody who's got young kids at home. But I'm flying less. I don't use paper, and I really try never to touch a piece of paper. And we don't allow single-use plastics in the bank. I made such a fool of myself. I went into our canteen and it's all paper and metal, and there was a plastic straw. And I took it up to the manager and said, "What is going on here?" And he said, "Wow, it's an idiot. That is a cellulose straw. And it's stronger than plastic, and it's completely recyclable and biodegradable." And I said, "Okay, fine." But I think these are stupid things. They're not stupid things. These are little things.
No, but these are good examples. But I'm sure that your daughter, I think it's your daughter who's here, holds you accountable, because I find that the younger people are much more idealistic than others.
It goes both ways.
What do you think?
It's doing okay.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say, you have been phenomenal. I've made you a president, the head of an MDB, in addition to your CEO role, and the head of global governance, supply chain expert, and you have just been absolutely phenomenal. I hope that you will agree with me that Bill's been amazing in just taking us through the issues. But I know that the dialogue has to continue. I mean, this is our earth, and if we're going to achieve that, the actions of leaders like you, but the actions of all of us. So I want you all to join me to give Bill another. Tiago, you and your colleagues of London Business School, thank you so much for your enthusiasm in helping us put this event together. To the Standard Chartered colleagues, thank you for all that you do. I'm obviously biased. I've worked with Standard Chartered for many years, through most of my career, doing some very fascinating deals. But the team that you have around you that work with us are absolutely phenomenal. And Razia is going to blush, but Razia is just simply amazing, and it's great to serve with her on the board of trustees for the Rural Africa Society. I also just want to say a big thank you to my other board of trustees, members of the board of the Rural Africa Society, my vice chair, Jide, Greg, Nick, and others. I'm looking around the room to see who else is here. I think we're absolutely committed to a world that really works for everyone, a world that is sustainable, and the climate agenda is a big issue for us. We've been holding lectures, bringing experts who are deeply committed, like you, Bill, to kind of help people understand what it takes. I want to thank my indefatigable, if I can say, right team, led by Nick, Hoder, Nico, Natasha. It's a very small team, but you always make miracles. So thank you so much. I'm sorry to publicly thank you, but it is my duty to do that because I know all the heavy lifting behind the scenes. So thank you very much. And finally, to each of you who is in this room, despite the rail strikes, I know that it shows that you're absolutely committed to Africa moving forward, to sustainability and to climate issues. So thank you very much, and I think I can reward you all with a cocktail.